Hi, my name is John Glenn, and today I would like to give a short talk on a review of the process of eutrophication of marine environments written by Val H. Smith. Eutrophication is a mechanism that can lead to large outbreaks of harmful and toxic algae. This can lead to further discussions of the elasticity of marine environments and why these outbreaks of harmful algae do not permanently damage and change their given environments. Here we see a simplified example of the eutrophication process. Eutrophication occurs in four simple steps. First, farmers apply fertilizer to the soil, then excess nutrients run off from the field into the water. Next, the fertilizer, that's rich in phosphate and nitrate, spark the overgrowth of algae in water bodies. When the algae forms, it blocks sunlight from entering the water and uses up all the oxygen. Eventually, water becomes oxygen depleted. Finally, water that is completely depleted of oxygen becomes a dead zone and can no longer support life. This is evident every day where we live in northeast Kansas. I work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out of Perry Lake, just north of Topeka. We have the third largest ag lease program in the Kansas City district. As a consequence of this, we see significant nutrient runoff, or loading, into the waters that people in turn recreate in, drink from, irrigate, and use in various ways every day. We will discuss how the eutrophication of marine environments hosts an ecosystem of harmful algae that, when conditions peak, lead to large outbreaks of algae that can have very negative effects on the ecosystem. Before we go on to how eutrophication can lead to these large algae blooms, first I'd like to go over a couple potential complications of large algae blooms. The first thing I'd like to go over is algae toxicity to humans. Exposure to any blue-green algae blooms can cause health effects in people and animals when water with blooms is touched, swallowed, or when the airborne droplets are inhaled. Exposure to high levels of this algae and their toxins can cause symptoms such as nausea or vomiting, skin or eye, or even throat irritation, and allergic reactions to breathing difficulties. As far as the economic cost goes, eutrophication accounts for almost one half of the impaired lake area and 60% of impaired river reaches within the United States alone. Eutrophication-related water quality impairment can be very substantial and have very negative economic effects. Eutrophic drinking water, such as the water that we have out at Perry, can supply reservoirs, for example, and they are much more likely to have higher treatment costs, greater difficulties in meeting standards for disinfection, and byproducts. Consumer complaints due to objectable taste and odor, and health hazards due to algotoxins in the finished drinking water. In coastal marine habitats, as far as the effects on wildlife, harmful algae blooms can render shellfish and finfish toxic or cause massive fish and shrimp kills. By mid 1994, there were over 3,000 reported incidents of human poisoning and 148 deaths in the Asian Pacific region alone due to algal blooms causing poisoning of fish. Economic losses can exceed over $1 million US per major event, and the monitoring efforts alone may cost up to 50,000 US for each affected area. This figure is going to show us the relative abundance of cyanobacteria and plankton in north temperate lake zones. It's going to be a prime example of how eutrophication can lead to large harmful algae blooms. Our dots on these graphs are going to be representative of the observations that were collected in the study, and the solid lines are going to be the average lowest trend lines. A lowest trend line is simply an average of all of the observations, and it helps create a smoothing effect for the graph and really helps us see the local regression trends of the observations. Our green trend line is going to be the fraction of cyanobacteria in the plankton, or how much of this harmful algae is in the organisms that live in the lake. And the red trend line is going to be the risk of the cyanobacteria dominating the ecosystem, or is seen in over 50% of the organisms in the lake. As you can see in each of our graphs, as the definition of eutrophication occurs in each of the lakes, or we see an increase of nitrogen and phosphorus, minerals in each of the lakes, our trends are going to increase along with the increased minerals. So we're going to see more cyanobacteria in general in each of the organisms, and we're also going to see that the risk of dominance from the algae is going to increase as well. On this slide, we're going to look at the statistical models that help create the trend lines on the graphs from the previous slide. When they were first trying to figure out the relationship between the total chlorophyll in the marine environments to the total biomass bloomage in the lake, they were looking at a linear relationship, which we can see represented here on this first equation. However, when they put that equation together, they got an r-squared value of 0.58, which is fine, but we would expect it to be a much stronger relationship based on our definition of eutrophication, where the more phosphorus and nitrogen we see in the water, the more strongly upward the regression showed on the graphs. In the second equation here, we can see where they did the same thing in the first equation. However, instead of matching it to a linear relationship, they matched it to a logarithmic relationship, which you can see increased the r-squared value of the relationship to 0.91, which is much more significant and is much closer to what we would expect to see. If you recall on that last slide, the more nitrogen and phosphorus we got into the marine environment, the more sharply increased the percentage of chlorophyll A in the ecosystem we saw. This last equation here just condenses this previous equation into a growing period where the farmers are planting their crops between March and October, where a lot more of that phosphorus and nitrogen is being dumped into the water. And you can see when we condense it to that growing period, we're going to see an r-squared of 0.76, which is still much more significant and close to what we would see than the linear value. On this slide, we're going to see another example of this logarithmic sort of regression. We can see that as total phosphorus on the bottom increases, we're going to see a drastic increase of cyanobacteria by biovolume. This actually comes from the Mississippi River, which hits pretty close to home for us. This really shows that any increase in phosphorus will, or eutrophication of any marine environment, will lead to a sharp directional shift of cyanobacteria algae blooms in the marine ecosystem. When we think of how eutrophication leads to large algae blooms, we really think about the algae that grows on the top layer, what we can see. Out at Perry, where I work, I oftentimes will see the blue-green algae growing on the surface layer and how that affects smaller fish and organisms that live kind of closer to the surface of the water. I've always been curious about whether or not the algae actually proliferates all the way down to the bottom of the lake at that benthic level where not a lot of other stuff grows. This figure here dives kind of into that question, where we can see that even at the benthic level, as total phosphorus or nitrogen increases or eutrophication is occurring, the chlorophyll A also increases. As we get out here further to the right, we can look up and see that the total nitrogen and phosphorus ratios are in fact what's leading to these chlorophyll A measurements or the algae blooms at the bottom of the lake. So far in the presentation, we've taken a look at how eutrophication leads to large algae blooms that can be harmful to humans and native species within their aquatic ecosystems. On this slide and from here on, I really wanted to look at how eutrophication can affect conservation efforts, especially here we'll see the effects on wetlands. This photo is a picture of the wetland marsh that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers manages out at Perry Lake where I work. For those of you who don't know, marshes are generally used for waterfowl habitat and for conservation. What's strange to me is that wetlands are a very common feature of many landscapes around the world, but we really don't see a lot of studies done on the impact of land use and nutrient loading on the water quality of these wetlands. Uh, Given the consistency of the algae responses to nutrient loading in lakes, we could expect to see a similar nutrient algae relationship observed in the wetlands. These graphs here are a plot of data from 22 marshes in the Great Lake Basin of Ontario, and they confirm that the suspended chlorophyll A in these wetlands responds strongly to the increase of average water column total phosphorus concentrations. What this tells me is eutrophication is really the driving factor of these algal blooms in any water aquatic ecosystem. If eutrophication or the leaching of these nitrates from different fields or land use by humans is occurring, then we're going to see large algae outbreaks. Eutrophication isn't just a problem we see here in the United States, it's a problem that's being discussed worldwide. Phosphorus is a key growth limiting nutrient for algae in lakes and reservoirs, and phosphorus-based eutrophication systems and management schemes have been developed worldwide. This table here is an example of the Swedish classification system for lakes. And in general, the growing season average biomass of algae in lakes is strongly dependent on the total phosphorus in the water. However, the relative abilities of nitrogen and phosphorus change consistently with cultural eutrophication, and the response of algae biomass to total phosphorus is strongly modified by the total nitrogen to total phosphorus ratio. So what that means is we're going to see a lot more eutrophication in areas where agricultural is more prevalent in the culture. Here in Kansas, what we see as eutrophication will vary differently with what occurs at European level land use, for example. Starting to wrap things up, how can we combat this eutrophication? By applying quantitative water quality criteria that can be developed at any stage of government, environmental protective agencies, we can set boundaries for the total nitrogen and phosphorus that are allowed to be used in fertilizers that landowners use, which contributes to the runoff into our water bodies. Uh, we can also use historical data, time series data, or reference regional data to establish values that reflect pristine water quality conditions, and it's completely free of any effects of human activity. Going back and seeing kind of how it was before we started using the land will help us get back to the way it was before all of our runoff was affecting the lakes and the waters. Finally, we can use survey methods that allow local users of the water resource to create quantitative estimates for the value of water quality. This will represent their perception of the critical point at which undesirable water is present in our ecosystem. Once these target goals have been established, we can create relationships between water quality and the nutrients that are running into the water to calculate critical water column nutrient concentrations that we need to attain in order to reach optimal conditions. This information can be linked to macroscale models of nutrient and water fluxes from lakes and rivers all the way to the coastal zones. In conclusion, our understanding of algae-related water quality is increasing every day, and it has a really strong foundation for the amount of studies that have been done up to this point. Eutrophication of water systems increases biomass of toxic algae outbreaks, and marine ecosystems will respond positively to our nutrient loading control efforts. Regulations that can be put on to nutrient loading will positively affect the outbreaks of large toxic algae. This is going to be the end of my short talk. For my final seminar presentation, I'll be also including a primary research article on eutrophication leading to large algae outbreaks. Thank you for your time.